Thank you so much, Sherry and Karen. I'm thrilled to be here as part of the Reading Together program. Jerry Dennis's book, The Living Great Lakes, is one of my favorite books about the Great Lakes. And he's not only a wonderful writer and a wonderful advocate for the Great Lakes, he's also very generous to other writers. He took the time to read the manuscript for my first book and gave me a quote to put on the back of that first book. So I think the world of Jerry Dennis, and I'm just thrilled to be part of this celebration of the Great Lakes. In 2009, as Sherry mentioned, I did my first adventure. I began in Chicago and walked around the bottom of the lake and continued back up into Michigan. And by that point, it finally didn't hurt so much to hike an average of 16 miles a day. And I started to really enjoy the hike, and I began calling it the adventure of a lifetime. As I continued into the Upper Peninsula, though, and down through Wisconsin, and I was getting closer and closer to the finish line in Chicago, I thought, this cannot be the only adventure I have. I'm having way too much fun. I was meeting fascinating people along the way. I was seeking out experts who were doing research on the lakes, and I learned so much on that first adventure. So even as I was completing the final steps of my 1,000-mile walk on the beach, I had already thought about doing a second one. Since I had gotten to know my favorite Great Lake, Lake Michigan, on the first hike, I thought I would touch all 5 for the second hike. These lakes are actually working together as a system to move water to the North Atlantic. Lake Superior flows into Lake Huron through the St. Mary's River. Lake Michigan flows generally to the east into Lake Huron. Lake Huron and Lake Erie have a very elaborate connection. That's the St. Clair River flowing into Lake St. Clair, and then the Detroit River flowing into western Lake Erie. Lake Erie pushes water to the northeast, then straight north up the Niagara River. That's where the waters take that plunge over Niagara Falls. Ontario, Lake Ontario has the water flowing out of it to the northeast in the St. Lawrence River. Now, at this point, the water has over 700 miles to go before reaching the North Atlantic. These waters are on a very slow and persistent journey. These numbers represent the mean amount of time any drop of water will spend in any given lake. And these numbers are in years. Wow. So think about that. Think about how long these waters are with us. Some of the water spilling over Niagara Falls today may have been in Lake Superior when French voyagers were paddling their canoes filled with pelts. This should give us pause when we think about polluting the lake, discharging sewage, untreated sewage into the lake. A lot of that stays with us for hundreds of years. To touch all 5 Great Lakes, I plotted my course. I began on the shores of Lake Erie in Port Clinton, Ohio. I hiked that elaborate connection between Erie and Huron, and all the way up to the top of the Mitten. I had a little extra time, so I actually curled around after hitting Mackinac City, and I made it all the way to Petoskey. I retraced some of my favorite steps on Lake Michigan. I caught a little flack for cutting across the middle of the Leelanau Peninsula. I was running out of time on my first hike, so I made sure that I hiked all the way to the tip this time. So I hiked from Sutton's Bay all the way down to Ludington. For Lake Superior, I hiked Pictured Rocks, National Lakeshore, end to end. And I also explored a little bit at the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula. The geology there is fascinating, and entire books have been written about the geology up there. I thought it only fitting to hike Lake Ontario in Ontario, so I hiked from the city of Belleville all the way into downtown Toronto. For the finale, I could think of no grander finish line than to finish at the Horseshoe Falls, so that was my finish line. I did this hike in 6 segments spread over 7 months. I did 1,004 miles total in 76 days of hiking, so I only averaged 13 miles a day on this hike, but I did a lot more camping, so at times I had up to 45 pounds on my back. My longest day was 27 miles. I can still feel that day in this hip. And my shortest day was 9 miles. That day was over 90 degrees though. I had 40 pounds on my back, and all the stable flies, those little biting flies, they all hatched that day. I have a little bit of video. It was a memorable day. The Great Lakes were formed by a series of incursions by these continental ice sheets that came down from the north. The last one retreated about 10,000 years ago. They scraped out the basins for our Great Lakes and then filled it with fresh glacial meltwater as they retreated. You probably know that story, but you may not have an idea of how tall these ice sheets were. This is the pier at Grand Haven. If the glacier was there today and the leading edge was at the pier, the sky would be obscured with ice. These ice sheets were 1 to 2 miles tall. So consider the amount of force coming to bear on the region to gouge out the basins for our Great Lakes. It's just fascinating. On my first hike, I became fascinated with the geology of the Great Lakes. I would hike on sand for days and days, and then all of a sudden it would transition into shale, and then blue-green shale, and then limestone. And I wondered, why are these different layers at the surface? I had always thought of geology as being like a multi-layered cake, where the older layers are down at the bottom. Well, and as a hiker, I like to think about cake, so that really appealed to me. And at one time, the Great Lakes Basin geology was like that, but the layers have actually been deformed. It's been pushed down in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the land, and then the lower levels have, is Mike cutting out? Sorry. Testing? Now it's back?
Yeah.
Yeah, the light is not on all the time. I don't know if that's the battery's going or what. Okay. So it was a multi-layered cake at one time, but the layers have been deformed. It's actually called a nested bowl formation because those lower levels, those oldest layers, have actually been flipped up, and you can walk them on the surface. The Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, those sandstone. So let me get my clicker. So the nested bowl formation, even the lowest layers, those oldest layers, have been brought up and are exposed in places at the surface. Pictured rocks, those sandstone formations, are much older, millennia older, than what you'll find in the center of the state of Michigan. For the beginning of this hike, I began in Port Clinton, Ohio, continued up through downtown Detroit, all the way along that elaborate connection, and then around the tip of the thumb. This was 302 miles that I did in the month of April 2012. The western part of Lake Erie looks perpetually muddy. If you've ever been there, anytime there's any movement in the water, it looks muddy and like there's a lot of silt suspended there, and that's because there is a lot of silt suspended there. The glaciers deposited a lot of rock just ground to the consistency of flour, and clay in the basin, and the Maumee River is continuing to bring that silt into Lake Erie, so that's why it looks muddy like this. The glaciers also deposited a very thick layer of clay in that reddish area there, and over hundreds of years it developed into a primordial swamp. It was called the Great Black Swamp. And in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when settlers were trying to get out of Ohio and into Michigan, because when you're in Ohio, you want to get into Michigan, right? This was a huge obstacle. This was a 1 million-acre swamp. People were afraid of this swamp because people would go into it and never be heard from again. They would take their wagons, and the muck would just absorb their wagons. It took decades to cut drainage ditches and to get the water out to Lake Erie and then to log it off. Of that 1 million acres, there's about 12,000 acres today that are still preserved as marshy wildlife habitat. If you're a birder, you may be familiar with the McGee Marsh or the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. That's because this is one of the premier birding sites in all of North America. People come over from Europe to Ohio to watch the birds here. There's 1 week in April where you can see an average of 200 species of birds moving through this area. Little warblers from Brazil will fly nonstop until they see Lake Erie and they stop here to rest. So it's amazing habitat. Since the edge of Lake Erie is so mucky and swampy, I had to walk on roads quite a bit along this stretch. And these canals paralleled many of the roads. The farmers' fields are tiled, and the water is pumped into these canals, and then it's systematically still pumped out to Lake Erie. One day when I was hiking, it rained a bit, and this pond bloomed in the middle of a farmer's field, and a whole bunch of swan, just pairs of swan just landed there like it was a perfectly normal thing. If we stopped interceding here, this land would quickly revert to that primordial swamp. Wow. Lake Erie is the youngest Great Lake. It was the last one to connect with the others to flow like I showed you in that earlier slide. For a time after the ice sheets retreated, the northern part of the Great Lakes Basin was physically depressed by the weight of the glaciers. You know how much a 10-pound bag of ice weighs? Think about a mile to 2 miles of ice. It physically depressed the upper region of the Great Lakes Basin. And for a time, the upper Great Lakes flowed to the north. It's fascinating. I continued back into Michigan and through the industrial corridor south of Detroit. This is the Rouge River. This is one of 4 rivers in the Great Lakes Basin to have burst into flames in the past. The Chicago River, the Buffalo River, and the poster child for the environmental movement, the Cuyahoga, are the other 3. A lot of the industry on the south side of Detroit is abandoned, warehouses and old factories, and some very creative people are climbing up into these abandoned buildings and painting graffiti on the inside of the windows. So it's creepy and festive at the same time. I continued into downtown Detroit and hiked underneath the Ambassador Bridge on Fort Street, and then made it all the way to the beautiful river walk in Detroit. If you haven't been downtown, this is one of the most hopeful things happening in Detroit. It's a beautiful paved area, and there are pathways and plantings and fountains. And it seems like anytime you give people access to that water's edge, people will return and care about it. I continued my hike up to Lake St. Clair. Now, Lake St. Clair is basically a floodplain between the 2 rivers. The average depth there is only 11 feet. You can see where the tugboat is moving. It's a different color. That's because that's the shipping channel. That has to be dredged out so lake freighters can move safely up and down the lake. There I am along the shores of Lake St. Clair. And Lake St. Clair was the first place that zebra mussels were introduced into the Great Lakes Basin. They were brought over from the other side of the world. They're native to the Caspian and Black Seas. They were brought over in ballast water on an ocean-going ship and then released into Lake St. Clair. And we know that they've spread very quickly throughout the Great Lakes Basin and into the Mississippi watershed too. Nowadays, it's kind of rare to find the dead ones washed up on the land though, because the quagga mussel, another invasive species, is even more aggressive and can survive in deeper water. So it is supplanting this invasive species. I continued along the St. Clair River. There is a trail designated along the river that I was on most of the time that kept me fairly close to the water. And the river is a wonderful place to see these lake freighters up close. The river gets fairly narrow in places. Sometimes they were so close I could have thrown a rock and hit them, but they frown upon that, so didn't do that. If you're interested in the lake freighters and this part of our economy, go to boatnerd.com. On that website, you can track all 200 vessels during the shipping season, see what flag they fly under, where they got their cargo, what they're carrying, and where they're taking it. And if you think about transporting goods, it's always cheaper to move goods and raw materials on the water. Cheaper than rail, cheaper than trucks. I made it all the way up to the city of Port Huron, the boyhood home of Thomas Edison. This is where Lake Huron funnels into the river. They have a statue of him there. He kind of looks happy in the statue, but he would be very angry that they put a statue because he hated this town. When he moved away, his dad still lived there, and he wrote long letters, "Why are you still living in Port Huron?" But they still claim him as a native son. The Canadian side of the river is very industrialized. This is Sarnia. And some of this industry is responsible for polluting the river, and the EPA is in the process of cleaning it up. There's a wonderful river walk again in this city. It's a beautiful place to watch these freighters slipping from the big lake into the narrow river. And the Blue Water Bridge are behind me. And I'm now on the shores of beautiful Lake Huron. Yay! I feel claustrophobic hiking by a river. I need the big water, so I was always very happy to get back to it. I continued up to the tip of the thumb. This is the Point Lighthouse. That's French for Point of Little Boats. And I love this sign. Isn't this a great sign? It's so clear, right? But I looked over the edge, and the shoreline was strewn with little broken stick people, so they're not listening. Not listening. These clouds are rare Kelvin-Helmholtz clouds. They look like waves in the air. They only happen when there are shearing winds at two different elevations, and in between little eddies form, and the eddies grab the clouds and make these wave-like forms. This is the first time I saw them clearly on my hike, and it looked like the sky was mimicking the waves that day. April 2012 was incredibly windy. There were times that there were gusts recorded on the thumb approaching 60 miles an hour. Now 16 miles an hour, when you have a big backpack on, the wind will just kind of push you around. So there were times I had to crouch down to avoid being thrown into the lake. That was a good day. I had to stay on M25 quite a bit along the outside of the thumb. But when I finally got to Port Austin at the very tip, there was this rugged, wild beach going west. And my rule as a hiker was to always stay at that edge where water met land wherever possible. So even if I was on a road, I would continue to go back to the shoreline and see if it was walkable. From that point, I had a 3-day hike to the ending point for this first segment. That ending point was Bay City. And this portion of the hike was 3 days all along the inside of Saginaw Bay. Saginaw Bay is shallow and protected, and the perfect environment for this invasive grass called Phragmites. I interviewed a woman along this stretch. She was in her upper 80s at that time. She had lived there her entire life, and she said 10 years before, you didn't see one stalk of Phragmites. So in 10 years, this invasive grass has choked off large portions of Saginaw Bay. There are places where they cut channels half a mile long to get boats in and out. I took a little break after that first 300 miles. And then in June, I returned to Bay City, and I continued up the east side of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, all the way to Mackinac City, and I had a little extra time, and I hiked that nice curve up there. 2012 was the year that Lakes Michigan and Huron hit their historic low. So Saginaw Bay was also quite low. And there were places it was just a mud flat as far as I could see. There's some beautiful habitat in Saginaw Bay though, and the waterfowl love it there. This is the first time I saw a pair of swans with more than 2 cygnets. There were actually 5. I think one was blocked by the female there. Just beautiful, beautiful little swan family there. I continued up through Pinconning. They have their cheese and their giant mouse sculpture. I had to hike on the road again through much of this because the edge of Saginaw Bay was so marshy, and there were times I did try to walk it and it would sink up to my knees in mud, which really slows you down. This is a rare wood turtle. This is the first one I've seen on my hikes. This is at the Rouge River. And this is a threatened species. It has a beautiful shell. It has nesting circles on its shell. I should have washed it up and had a photo shoot, but it was like, come on, lady, I'm 5 stories up. So we had a little chat, and then no, he wasn't thrilled, but isn't he beautiful? Mm-hmm. Yeah. When Michigan became a state, they charged Douglas Houghton with the task of exploring the state to find natural resources that could be developed. He looked for things like copper, iron ore, and salt. Salt was vital for preserving food at the time. And he also looked for alabaster. Alabaster is similar to gypsum, which is the white stuff in our drywall today. Back then, though, farmers loved alabaster. If they had a field that was too acidic, they could take this and sow it into the soil and magically grow crops where no crops would grow before. So it was highly prized. They used to mine this deposit and then convey it out to this floating shed to then load it onto boats. But today it's still being mined, and there's a high pressure pipeline that takes it out to the lake freighters, and they can load it right onto there. You see the towns or the little settlements of Alabaster and Port Gypsum. That's where that deposit is. I continued up around the top of Saginaw Bay and down the point, Taoist Point, which is a beautiful state park. There's a historic lighthouse there. And once I got to the Lake Huron side of the point, there was this wide sandy beach again to walk. This point is also a stopping area for migratory birds, and they were feeding the orioles as they were passing through. This was in June. Amphibians are very sensitive to changes in the environment. If it's polluted, or the pH is off, or there's heavy metals, you will never see tadpoles like this. So anytime I went by this wriggling pool of frogs to be, I was really encouraged that the environment was healthy. This is the Asaba River, which flows into Lake Huron through the town of Oscoda. Any river within the Great Lakes Basin has a history associated with the logging phase that went on throughout the Great Lakes Basin. If you were standing on the spot in 1930, you would have seen nothing but stumps. There's a beautiful monument to the work of the lumbermen here, and it honors their work because much of this lumber went west with the settlers who were heading to the prairie states, where there were no trees to build homes and cities, towns. The longest stretch of sandy beach on Michigan's east coast of the Lower Peninsula is between Oscoda and Harrisville. And I can tell you that because I've hiked the entire east coast of the Mitten. There's a beautiful, like 10 or 12 mile stretch. It was along this stretch that I saw this dead round goby washed up. Now it doesn't look too menacing there. This is a young little fry, but they get up to 10 inches long and they're very aggressive. They outcompete our native fish. This fish is native to the other side of the world again transported here by ballast water. As I continued north, I came upon a rockier shoreline. This is limestone cobble that's been dragged around by the glaciers. Find the frog there? Mm-hmm. And this was June, so the wildflowers were blooming, the wild lilies and the bluebells or harebells. You can see I have my large pack on there. I did do quite a bit of camping on this hike compared to my first hike. And Negrogon State Park is near Alpena. It's a beautiful state park. There are only a few campsites, but they're all right on Lake Huron. You have to hike into them, but you couldn't be more secluded if you wanted to be. I generally hike with my hammock tent. The brown part is the hammock part, and the green part is actually a rain fly. This night was so mild, though, there wasn't going to be any rain, so I took the rain fly off and I was able to watch the sunset. And then all the stars come out. The town of Osneek has their own monument to the lumbermen. And if you're going to go through the trouble to put up Paul Bunyan, you got to do Babe, right?
That's right.
It's right along the highway there. Just hilarious. As I continued north, I came across this layer of shale exposed at the surface of the lakeshore. This is near Squaw Bay. The Nature Conservancy has stepped in to preserve Squaw Bay, and I'm so glad they did, because this is one of the most biodiverse areas I've hiked through on all 3,000 miles at this point. There were more varieties of freshwater shellfish here than I had seen anywhere else on my hikes. And the frogs were hanging out, so you know it's a healthy environment. Just northeast of Alpena, there is a played out limestone mine called the Rockport Mine. This land has been conveyed to the state. It is a recreation area now, but the land is clearly altered from the mining activities. Near the pier, the deteriorating pier, there are these large piles of limestone aggregate and even pieces of old rusting mining equipment sticking out. This is where all the limestone was sourced to build the Mackinac Bridge. So this was the aggregate they mixed with all the concrete to sink the pilings for that bridge. Nature will persist in even these altered areas. I ran into this baby groundhog here. I've seen adult groundhog my entire life, but this was the first baby I had ever seen. So we had a little chat. And lest you think it was a walk on the beach, this is some of the hiking. along this stretch. When the rocks are that big, it's easier to stay on top of them so you don't get a boot wedged between the rocks. So I have bionic ankles at this point.
You turn your ankle that way?
Not to the point of hurting it. Yeah. Near Thompson's Harbor State Park, I was hiking through that beautiful state park, and a line of thunderstorms came through that were the most active I've ever seen. There were more lightning strikes in a 10-minute period than I've seen in like 3-hour thunderstorms. So that was thrilling. I was hiking with an aluminum pole, and the scientist part of my brain said, it's aluminum, it doesn't conduct electricity. And the other part of my brain said, get it away from you. Oh. After the rain, though, all the wildflowers came out. This is Indian paintbrush and a wild lily. And the temperate orchids were finally beginning to bloom, the lady's slippers. And anytime it rains, it's easy to find the petoskes, right? Now, people will tell you can only find petoskes on Lake Michigan. Not true, not true. I've found beautiful specimens along Lake Huron. This one was as big as a donut.
Wow.
But then the rest of the day, all I could think about was, where is my donut?
Yeah.
Near Rogers City, I got a tour of the Calcite limestone mine. This is one of the largest open pit limestone mines on the planet. Each one of those trucks takes over 200 tons in each load. It's very difficult to get the scale of these machines until you see me in the shot.
Holy cow.
And they let me stand in the loader too. I actually got to ride in the dump truck, and I'm like, let me drive it. There's nothing to hit here. It's a mine. But they frowned upon that. Yeah, definitely. The next thing I'll show you is a piece of video from the halfway point of this adventure. And this was the 90-degree day, and you'll see the flies. So it is on this site, right here where I'm standing, within sight of the 40-mile Point Lighthouse, that I have reached 500 miles of my trek. Halfway. And I'm on the shores of Lake Huron, just about 7 miles north of Rogers City, which is a lovely little town if you have not been. They're so friendly there, it's almost scary. I'm kind of wrapped up today, as you can see, even though it's a warm day, because there are these little, they look like houseflies, but they have fangs, so they're biting flies that are swarming today, and kind of unpleasant, but if I wrap up and keep moving, they seem to just swarm on my pants. Right now I have a couple hundred just hanging out on my pants. This is the halfway moment. I just wanted to stop and kind of look back to Port Clinton on the shores of Lake Erie. Realize that I've come all the way up back into Michigan along the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair River, and then around the thumb, Saginaw Bay, and now on the beautiful shores of Lake Huron. Memorable. It was a memorable day. This is the lighthouse I referenced, the 40-mile Point Lighthouse. It's quite unusual in that it's square, not round. You can go up in the tower for a beautiful view of Lake Huron, and they have the original Fresnel lens there, and not every Great Lakes lighthouse has that. As I continued north, the moths got larger and larger. Have you noticed this going up north?
Yeah.
This last one is called a Laurel Sphinx. It was about 5 inches wingtip to wingtip. It was beautiful. I almost could have ridden it, but that breaks my rules as a hiker. Made it all the way up to the mighty Mackinac Bridge. I'll put this bridge up against any in the world for beauty and grace. I took another short break after that, and then I headed to Lake Superior. Now, Lake Superior is named that because it is geographically above the other Great Lakes, but it is superior by any measure you wish to put on it. It's the deepest, the coldest, the cleanest, the wildest. It contains more water than the other 4 Great Lakes combined, and you can throw in a couple extra Lake Eries. I hiked Pictured Rocks, National Lakeshore end to end, and also explored a little bit at the tip of the Keweenaw. Lake Superior has a wonderful collection of colorful rocks. Many of these dragged down from the Canadian Shield and deposited into the basin. And Lake Superior does a wonderful job of tumbling them for you. It's a rockhound's paradise. And you can also find the elusive agate up there. This one has been sliced in half, so you can see the interior. Now, agates only form in this region because millennia ago, before the Great Lakes were formed, there was a continental rift in the Lake Superior Basin area that opened up and spewed magma for millions of years. It spewed so much magma that it collapsed the Earth's crust. Now, this is one of the reasons that Lake Superior is so much deeper than the other Great Lakes. When that magma finally cooled, it became basaltic rock, and quite often there are air pockets within that rock. And over time, water will matriculate through the rock, depositing layer after layer of silica in those voids, and that's how agates are thought to be formed. The colored bands are from impurities that also get in there with the silica. Now, I had been on the boat tour a couple times up there, but I had never hiked on top of these formations, and it's really a different perspective. Now, you might look at this and think, wow, it's been like that forever, but this is sandstone. Sandstone is quite porous, and within my lifetime, a portion of the top of that formation, there used to be 2 turrets up there. One just fell off into the lake. And if you look at the bottom of this formation, Lake Superior is carving that every year. So it's a very dynamic system, geologically speaking. My son Ben joined me on this portion of the hike. I generally hike alone, but his schedule worked with mine and he was along with me. He looks tiny there, but he's about 6 foot tall. This rabbit hopped around our campsite the first night, and as the sun set, her ears glowed on her head. Yeah, the view from the top of these bluffs is just amazing. It's a really different perspective than from the boats. This is a strange plant that completely lacks chlorophyll. It does not photosynthesize. It's called Indian pipe or the ghost plant. It's parasitic. It's actually feeding on fungi in the soil, which in turn is feeding on the tree roots. So this is the first time I had seen it in the wild. After a while, those sandstone bluffs subsume into a couple beautiful coves, and in the middle of the National Lakeshore, there's a 12-mile-long sandy beach. It's just gorgeous. If you only have taken the boat tour, you miss the middle portion here, this beach. This is one of the few times I had someone with me, so instead of setting the timer and running, I was able to get some shots as I moved away. You can see this beach just goes on and on forever, and very few people are on this stretch because it's right in the middle of the National Lakeshore.
Is it hard walking on that sand?
No, it's fairly well packed. It's not bad walking. Yeah. Now you see how calm Lake Superior is here? It was in the 80s when Ben and I hiked up here, and since the lake was so calm, it wasn't getting cooled down by redistributing the water, and the water in the shallow parts actually warmed up to the point where Ben and I swam in Lake Superior every day without getting brain freeze. And I was up there last year, and I got brain freeze every time I hit that water. On the eastern end of the lakeshore, there's this massive perched dune. And when they were logging off this area before it was protected, they constructed a wooden chute to guide the logs down to the lake. And quite often, the logs would create enough friction on the way down to make the chute burst into flames. If you notice the Keweenaw Peninsula, after we finished at Pictured Rocks, Ben and I headed up to the Keweenaw and explored a little at the tip there. And if you notice the angle of the Keweenaw and the angle of Isle Royal, you can see they're basically on the same angle. That's because that continental rift that I mentioned was right in between those two, and the collapse of the Earth's crust happened in between those two landforms, flipping up the Keweenaw and Isle Royal. So those two landforms are geologically very similar, and it's called a syncline when that happens, when the Earth falls in and then flips two edges up. The rock you'll find at the tip of the Keweenaw is this reddish basaltic rock. It's red because there's a lot of iron up there, as you probably have noticed, well, just the city names up there. And as you walk closer and closer to Lake Superior, you see how efficient the lake is at grinding these pebbles, these rocks down to pebbles and then fine sand. Ben is standing on a layer of slate that is actually tilted up because of this syncline formation. The geology is fascinating up here. You can actually walk the layers in a very short period of time. For the next segment of this hike, I headed into Ontario to hike along the northern shore of Lake Ontario. But before hiking the shoreline, I wanted to explore an area north that was also shaped by the Great Lakes. Remember I mentioned that for a time the northern Great Lakes flowed to the north after the retreat of the glaciers? Well, as that land rebounded, the lakes eventually evened out, and then for a short time, Lake Huron flowed directly into Lake Ontario. Scientists theorized that the water was probably held back by a massive ice dam, because when the water moved through here, it wasn't a river or even a raging wild river. It was a wall of water 5 to 10 stories tall. So that wall of water came through here and carved these rocks in a way I haven't seen elsewhere. There are formations here called kettles. And they're formed when all that water came through and whipped around, forming whirlpools, just massive whirlpools. And sometimes they would spin a rock at the bottom of them, or just the force of that whirlpool itself would carve out the limestone here. And I am sitting on one of the kettles now, on the rim of one of them. My legs are dangling down into it. And I'm going to turn the camera now. You can see the smoothed walls of this kettle whipping around and around until it finally bore a hole all the way through the bottom. It's a fascinating formation. It was about 8 feet down to the land below. That was the largest kettle in the park, but there were many places where it looks like someone had taken a huge pneumatic drill and just drilled into the limestone. Just very fascinating. And the water also carved out subterranean caves here and lifted and altered these limestone slabs. I kept expecting hobbits to pop out. It was very surreal. This is the Warsaw Caves Conservation Area, a park. That's what Canada calls their parks. And it's really worth a day trip. All these formations are very close to where you can park. You don't have to hike 20 miles to see them, and it's fascinating. After exploring that area, I headed to the shoreline again and hiked on Ontario's Waterfront Trail. This trail is actually established all the way from Montreal down onto the northern side of Lake Erie, and they're trying to extend it all the way to Windsor. Now, the law in Canada is that landowners can own right up to the edge of the water, so there is no public corridor like we enjoy here in Michigan. So I had to stay on this trail most of the time. The early part of this hike was quite agrarian, but there were places that were public areas like boat launches and beaches where I could get back to that water's edge. There were beautiful overlooks on this trail and wild areas. And it also wound through some very historic villages, so I was able to explore the history on the northern side of Lake Ontario. And then it went right through the buffer zone of a nuclear power plant, which, where do they let you do that? As long as you're not hunting, you can hike through there. And it also went through some semi-industrial areas. It was a very interesting experience. And then it did this. Where else can you do that? And later that day, got back to the lakefront on this beautiful bridge with a beautiful view of Lake Ontario. And I really respect Ontario and Canada for giving people access to all of the shoreline, not just the pretty beaches or the little towns, but all of it. That way their citizens and even visitors can be in touch with what's happening on the shoreline, whether it's being treated right or industrialized or polluted. So it was a very interesting hike all the way into downtown Toronto and the beaches there. Toronto has some of the cleanest urban beaches in the Great Lakes Basin. They've done a lot to restore wetlands along their side of the lake, and wetlands are vital for cleansing water before it returns to the lake. For the bulk of my remaining miles, I hiked some of my favorite steps on, rehiked some of my favorite steps on Lake Michigan, and also got out to the Manitou Islands, which are part of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. This is Leland on the Leelanau Peninsula, Fishtown, and the lighthouse at the tip, the Grand Traverse Lighthouse. It was there that I saw one of the best sunsets of my life. It was like Mars was rising. It was just gorgeous. Now in 2009, when I hiked all the way around Lake Michigan, I could not walk Sleeping Bear Dunes at the edge of the water the entire way. The lake was up and there were places where it was impossible to get through. But in 2012, with the lowering of the lake, I was able to stay at the shoreline all 30 plus miles. If you've been up there, you've seen these massive perched dunes right along the lake. Anytime you see a dune that lacks vegetation, it's called a living dune. It's still responding to gravity, wind, and waves. So it's a very dynamic system. You'll see at the top of this dune, the wind is actually carving the top of this dune. It's quite beautiful. And this is my favorite vista along Sleeping Bear. This is the Empire Bluff Trail. You'll recognize this, if not from your own hike, then from the early Pier, Michigan ads. This is looking north past the town of Empire to Sleeping Bear Dune, and then offshore you'll see South Manitou Island. This trail is not that difficult. If you get out there, it's well worth the little hike up the hill. It's beautiful. So for the finale, I decided to hike from the shores of Lake Ontario to the finish line of Niagara Falls. A little dramatic, right? Now the falls are there because of the Niagara Escarpment. The escarpment runs through the upper Great Lakes in that arc that's outlined there in red. Now, the Niagara Escarpment is a hardened layer of limestone that's incredibly resistant to erosion, and it resisted the onslaught of those glaciers. So all the landforms that you see underneath that red line, like the Bruce Peninsula, Manitoulin Island, the Garden Peninsula, and the Door Peninsula, they all are here with us today because the glaciers were unable to scrub them away. And northern Lake Huron has thousands of islands, and most of those islands have that limestone cap from the Niagara Escarpment. This was a 2-day hike, and I always invite people to join me to hike the last part of my hikes. And this was the group on the first day, and more people joined on the second day, and they were particularly enthusiastic. And that was my finish line. Niagara Falls, and I have to show it to you in motion, right?
Oh, yeah.
The complete story of this adventure can be found in my second book, A 1,000-Mile Great Lakes Walk. This is the book that won the Great Lakes Great Reads Award, and that is awarded by independent bookstores. I'm very proud of that. And my first book is A 1,000-Mile Walk on the Beach, still available, and I'd like to thank Michigan News Agency for bringing my books here tonight for you to buy, and they should have the third book early also. This is the cover of the third book, A 1,000-Mile Great Lakes Island Adventure. And honestly, the third adventure, I learned the most. I knew very little about, I knew a lot about a few islands, but I had no idea about the variety and diversity of the islands in the Great Lakes. So I visited islands all the way from Isle Royale, hunting moose bones with the Moose Watch group, to Montreal, which is on an island in the St. Lawrence River. So it was a fascinating experience. I'd be very happy to take any questions you have at this time. Yes?
Did you bring us any pictures of how raggedy your feet got when you were so...
My feet? You want to see my
Only
feet?
she would want to see your
I
blisters.
remember reading that part where you had to go home and recover.
Yeah, the first 72 miles, yeah, that was pretty rugged. No, I won't show you pictures of that.
I
No.
appreciate that.
Yeah, I learned how to take care of my feet though, and I didn't have
Because
blisters.
I know you said you trained and everything.
Yeah, it's very difficult to train for that first 72 miles going from Chicago through all that industry and then onto
But, I
sand.
mean, you got so bad you had to go home for a while.
Well, no, I planned to take a break, but it was only 3 days.
Oh,
So I put my feet up for 3 days and then I went back to hike.
wow.
Yeah.
How do you get home? You walk?
No, I would have people pick me up. I took the train into Chicago and I walked back to Michigan and then I had people pick me up and take me home. Yes?
Those limestone kettles,
Yeah.
how long does it take for that to form? How long did that water?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. How long did that water move through the Warsaw Caves Conservation Area to form those kettles? I don't know that for sure. I know 5,000 years ago was when the lake started flowing in the pattern I showed you. So it was between when the glaciers retreated and the land rebounded. So, I mean, it could have been up for several hundred years that blew through there. I don't know for sure. Yes?
What made you decide to do this trip?
What made me decide to do this trip? Well, the first one was because of kind of a midlife crisis. I needed to take on something quite big, and I figured I'd get to know my favorite place step by step. So I walked around Lake Michigan, and I can't seem to stop. I don't know. Yes?
Didn't it scare you being a woman out there by yourself all that time?
Did it scare me being a woman out there by myself? Not really. I know how to keep myself safe, and I'm usually walking so fast, someone's going to have to work to keep up with me. And I walk with a stick usually, so come on.
You know how to use it as a weapon.
Yeah, yeah. Way in the back.
Do you have a collection of artifacts or rocks or anything from your trip, and where do you display them or keep them?
In my office. I have rocks from all over the Great Lakes, beautiful specimens. I went through some very remote areas and I would find Petoskey's, you know, like a little bread loaf, just beautiful. A lot of fossils, and I usually use a wooden walking stick that I just find and strip the bark off of. So I have several of those. Some of those have over 500 miles on them. So I had one that I took up to Isle Royal. It already had 500 miles on it. It made it through that trek and I had everyone sign it. So, yeah.
Did you come across a lot of Native American artifacts?
Did I come across Native American artifacts? No, I never even found an arrowhead, and I always look for them. I know people who have found them along the Great Lakes, but I have never found one. No.
Did you study all this? I mean, are you a geologist? I mean, you just walk out the door and start studying.
Did I study this? I read everything I could get my hands on. I do have a master's in the biological sciences, but I never studied geology until I started doing this, and then I just kind of taught, you know, read everything I could get. I love to learn, and I have an MFA in writing, so I got to be a scientist and a writer and to learn things. So I kind of created my ideal job, honestly. Way in the back.
Would you tell the story of the walking stick that you used on your search for the woman carved for you?
Certainly. Well, I tell the story of the walking stick that I used for the finale of my third trip. A woman in Big Rapids came to one of my events, and afterwards she said, "I love your books." She's in her 80s. She said, "I love your books. I'm going to carve you a walking stick." And I'm like, okay. So she kept emailing me like, "Can you send me a map of your first trip? Can you send me a map of your second trip? And then how big is your grip size?" And I'm like, this woman is serious. So when I went up to Big Rapids to the bookstore again to have an event, she presented it to me, and it was painted, and it had the state bird and flag, and the grip was wrapped in leather. It's a piece of art. It's not just a walking stick. But I thought to honor her, I would take it to Mackinac Island for the final miles of my third adventure. So I hiked Mackinac Island with that beautiful, beautiful stick. Yeah. Yes?
Do you know any other people that have done some of this?
Do I know?
Is there a club of people?
Is there a club of crazy people doing this? I know there is a First Nations woman from a Canadian tribe who has hiked around every single Great Lake. Her name is Josephine Madamin, and she felt called to be a protector of the lakes. So she has walked around every single Great Lake, and she started in her 60s. And I've seen video of her walking, and I would have trouble keeping up with her. She is just on a mission to protect the Great Lakes. And I know a couple who have walked all the way around Lake Superior, and they have written a book. Yes? What did I do about food? I always had chocolate. Things could go awry if I did not have chocolate. But I would have dehydrated food. I mean, if I was camping for a while, I have a little compact stove and even packets of dehydrated mashed potatoes. Fantastic. But you can get almost any meal dehydrated and shrunk down. For a lot of these hikes, large sections, I would stop in towns at night and actually find a bed and breakfast because they make you breakfast. So, and that was a way I could resupply in towns. There were only a few stretches like Pictured Rocks, which is a national lakeshore, that I was hiking for 5 days and I had to carry everything on my back, water purifier, stove and everything else. And Isle Royal is also backcountry. You're shaking your head like there's no way in the world you would do that. Yes?
What's the best way for the individual to help get somebody to do something about, the pollutions, and I know you have some suggestions.
Yeah, what's the best way for the individuals to be involved with protecting the Great Lakes? I do list 5 organizations in the back of each of my books that do wonderful work. And some of them you can sign up for an email newsletter. So you can keep updated on legislation or other things that are going on in the Great Lakes. So that's a wonderful way to just keep in touch. And when there's a bill going through, you can write your senators. And the Alliance for the Great Lakes usually has a web page where you can just put in your information and it will go to your representatives. The Nature Conservancy does wonderful work. By setting aside land, they create a legacy. You don't have to worry about our kids caring about the Great Lakes because that land is preserved. But the Alliance for the Great Lakes does wonderful work with education, policy making, and they also do work on the ground, grassroots, get out there, pick up trash. So those are the 2 top organizations that I would say get involved with, or at least keep in touch with and be informed. That's the vital thing. That's why I love Ontario. They're letting their citizens be informed with their lakeshore. You can know what's going on by riding your bike and seeing the nuclear power plant. There are 2 along that stretch. So, do we have time for more, or shall?
Did you have any
Oh.
problems at all with wildlife?
Did I have wildlife problems?
I mean, any scary
Encounters.
experiences?
Well, there were signs up in Sleeping Bear Dunes on my first hike that said cougar had been seen in the area. And there was one stretch I was hiking where I thought I smelled a cougar, and I was very frightened. But I had been hiking for days in the same clothes, and it was actually just me. So, yeah. Otherwise, I didn't have any trouble with wildlife. I saw a lot of wildlife. I saw a river otter playing in Lake Huron.
A bear?
Yeah. I've seen bear tracks. Oh, actually, on the 3rd adventure, I saw a bear out in the Apostle Islands. Yeah. And I saw moose on Isle Royal, and I heard wolves at night, which was thrilling. Yes?
Could you just camp anywhere, or did you have to arrange designated sites ahead of time?
Can you camp anywhere, or do you have to arrange sites? It depends. In some place like a national lakeshore, like Pictured Rocks, you have to have a reservation, and you have to be on the site assigned to you. It's very strict. There were other stretches where I just backcountry camped because it was wild and open, and I just set up camp. And there's also a permit you can get from the DNR that allows you to camp on national or state forest land. So I carried one of those with me in case I was going through a stretch where there was a state forest, like the Hiawatha Forest is a large swath of the Lower Peninsula. So there were a variety of ways. I mean, sometimes I was in a campground, and I paid for a site. One time in Wisconsin, I strung up my hammock tent between 2 huge RVs. And people looked at me and they were so sad for me, so they invited me for dinner. So, yes.
How would you entertain yourself for those hours during the day when you walk?
How would I entertain myself? Well, I had done so much reading about the section I was walking that it was wonderful to have that time to really think about all the research I had been reading and to think about questions and to kind of put it all together. There were times if I was in bear country, I would sing out loud a lot just to keep the bear aware. But generally, I don't mind time alone, and especially time to have complex, connected thoughts. And in modern society, that's very difficult to have with everything ringing and beeping and buzzing.
Loreen, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Yes,
My
thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you all for coming out. I will be signing books at the back. I'd be happy to talk to you more if you want to chat back there.